greedy layer-wise training. This greedy layer-wise training, it is an important milestone in the history of deep learning. It basically allowed the early development of network with more hidden layers than it was previously possible. Because we have deep neural network, we need to perform complex calculations in a neural network to achieve the right results. For this, we require adding more and more hidden layers to perform these complex calculations and to receive the correct output. So for this greedy layer-wise training method, it is generally used. Now, pre-training, it involves successively adding a new hidden layer to the model. Initially, when we start working on our neural network, we do not involve all the hidden layers together. In greedy layer-wise technique, what do? We keep on adding the layers into our neural network one by one, the hidden layers. Obviously, the input and the output layer will be there because it has to provide the input and the output layer has to give us a result. But these hidden layers, they are performing all sort of calculations there. So, these layers to achieve the correct output have to work on all kind of calculations. So, here pre-training, it involves adding a new hidden layer to a model and then refitting it, allowing the newly added model to learn the inputs from the existing hidden layers, often while keeping the weights for the existing hidden layers fixed. So this gives this particular technique the name layer-wise, as our model is trained one layer at a time. We are having one hidden layer at a time and we are performing the calculations. After that, we do add one more hidden layer. Next, we do add one more hidden layer. So that is why we keep on making our neural network deep, one by one, by adding more and more hidden layers to that. So that is why this approach is called layer-wise. Now, this approach is also called greedy layer-wise training. So this technique, it is referred to as greedy because the piece-wise or the layer-wise approach to solve the harder problem of training a neural network. That is why we call it greedy, because we are adding more and more layers to it to solve the harder and harder problems. As an optimization process, dividing the training process into the succession of layer-wise training process, it is seen as a greedy shortcut, which likely leads to an aggregate of locally optimal solution. So it is a shortcut that is good enough to obtain the global solution. So that is why we call it greedy layer-wise training. Why? Because we are adding one layer at a time and we calculate our outputs. Then to achieve more accurate output, we do add more layers, and to perform more and more calculations on that, we might start our training our neural network with very simple problems initially. Then we can input some more complex problems to it, So that is why we call it a greedy approach. And because we are adding the layer one by one to it to make our deep neural network as a whole. So that is why we call it layer-wise training method. Basically, greedy algorithms, they break a problem into many components. Then they solve for the optimal solution of each component in isolation. So basically, it works in isolation for every layer, for every component. Unfortunately, sometimes combining the individually optimal components, it is not guaranteed to yield an optimal complete solution. For that, we have to work on more to achieve the correct results. So here, pre-training, it is based on the assumption that it is easier to train a shallow network in which we have limited layers. instead of a deep network, and it contributes a layer-wise training process that we are always only overfitting a shallow model. So basically, in a shallow neural network, we have limited number of layers and we are receiving the output. But nowadays, since we are dealing with all kind of real world problems, we are applying a neural network in all kind of real world applications. So we require deep neural network, which can process all form of data and which can perform complex calculations to give us the exact results. So for this, we are using a deep neural network. The key benefits of pre-training. What are the key benefits since we are pre-training a neural network? So what are the key benefits for it? First, this process, it is a simplified training process. It does not require much of the hassle. Second, it facilitates the development of the deeper networks. Third, it is useful as a initialization scheme. It is with initialization scheme, it is more useful. And perhaps it do provide lower generalization errors. So these are the key benefits why we are pre-training our neural network. Now there are basically two approaches to our pre-training. One is the supervised greedy layer-wise training approach. Another one is the unsupervised. In supervised training approach, we have certain labels. We have already classified certain classes in which we categorize our inputs. But in unsupervised greedy layer-wise training, pre-training approach, what happens? Any sort of random data can be our input, and we are just dividing them into different classes. So that is why we call it unsupervised greedy layer-wise pre-training. So these are two basic approach in which we can pre-train our neural network. Talking about the optimization for training the deep neural network. What is optimization? Basically, optimization algorithm. It finds the value of the parameters. Here our main parameters are the weights, which minimize the error when mapping the inputs to the outputs. So what does our optimization algorithm do? It helps us to find the parameters which minimize the error when we are mapping the inputs to the outputs. These optimization algorithms, or we can call them optimizers, they widely affect the accuracy of our deep learning models, and they as well as affect the speed of the training of the model. So there are many aspects of our optimization of neural network weights that make the model challenging. But three often mentioned features of our landscape are the errors that we have to deduct. What errors do face when we are pre-training our neural network? So these are the presence of, first of all, local minima. Second is a flat region. And third is the high dimensionality of the search space. These are the main three problems that we have to deal with when we are training our deep neural network. Talking about the first one, that is local minima. Local minimum or local optima. It refers to the fact that the error landscape, it contains multiple regions where the loss is relatively low. In a neural network, we have certain local minimas where we see that the loss is relatively low. So there can be multiple regions like that. Second one is the flat region, or we can also call it saddle points. A flat region or a saddle point, it is a point on the landscape where the gradient is zero. These are the flat regions, normally at the bottom of the valley, or the regions between the peaks. Suppose these are two peaks, there is a flat region in between. So the problem is that a zero gradient means that the optimization algorithm, it does not know which direction it has to go to. So for the purpose of improvisation of our model, in our training of our neural network, what we are trying to do, we are trying to improvise our model. we are trying to make improvements in our neural network. So when we reach a flat region or a saddle point, in that particular region, our network, it does not know that in which direction it should go to achieve more improvement. So those kind of regions, they are called the flat regions or the saddle point. Third, high dimensionality. Our search space that we are working on, it is highly dimensional. So the optimization problems solved when training a neural network, it is highly dimensional. Every weight in the network, it represents another parameter or dimension of the error surface. So deep neural network, they often have millions of parameters, making the landscape to be navigated by the algorithms extremely high dimensional as compared to our earlier traditional machine learning algorithm. Talking about gradient descent deep learning optimizer. Now, here we will be talking about some forms of optimizers that we use in our neural network. So before that, we should understand some basic terms that we are going to use when we are describing these kind of optimization algorithm. The first term, that is epoch. So if you find such a term in these optimization algorithm, so you should know what is epoch. The number of times the algorithm runs on the whole training data set, means how many times our algorithm it is running or on the whole training set. That is called epoch, the number of times. So first one is epoch. Second is sample. If we have a certain data set, a single row of the data set, that is called a sample for our optimization algorithm. Third, batch. What is batch? Batch denotes the number of samples to be taken for updating the model parameters. Means how many number of samples are required if we want to update our model parameters like weights, etc. of a neural network. So that number of samples, that we call a batch. Next one, learning rate. Learning rate, it is a parameter which provides the model a scale of how much model weights should be updated. So that is the learning rate. Talking about the next one, that is a cost function or the loss function. So a cost function, it is used to calculate the cost, what is called the difference between the predicted value and the actual value. Talking about the last one, that is weights or the bias. So the learnable parameters in the model which control the signal between the two neurons, that is called the weight or the bias. The learnable parameter in our model which controls the signals between two neurons or two nodes of our neural network. So these parameters, learnable parameters, they are called the weights or the bias. So these are few basic terms that we will be coming when we are discussing all these kinds of optimization algorithm: epoch, sample, batch, learning rate, cost function, and the weights or bias. Talking about gradient descent, how does it work? Gradient descent, basically we are using it normally in a neural network. We have studied that we do have two kind of problems: vanishing gradient descent problem and exploding gradient descent problem. So how does it work? So it works like, first of all, it starts with some coefficient. It sees their cost and it searches for the cost value which is lesser than what it is now. Second, it will move towards the lower weight, and so it will update the value of the coefficients. Now, the process, it will be repeated again and again until our local minimum is reached. So, a local minimum is what? It is a point beyond which we cannot proceed. So, that is how the gradient descent works. First of all, it will start with certain coefficients and it will check the cost of it, and then it will try to search for the cost value which is lesser than what it is now. Second, it will move towards the lower weight and it will update the value of the coefficient. Thirdly, it will keep on repeating this problem till when? Till we reach the point of local minimum. Local minimum, it is a point beyond which we cannot proceed. That is the final thing. So, normally this gradient descent, it works best for most of the purposes. However, obviously there are certain ups and certain downs of every algorithm. So, this gradient descent, it also has some downsides too. First of all, it is too expensive to calculate the gradients if the size of our data is huge. In this, we are trying to calculate the gradient, but if our data size is huge, then it will become too expensive. Gradient descent, it works well for the convex function, but it does not know how far to travel along the gradient for non-convex functions. For non-convex functions, it does not know how far to travel. So that is another problem that we have in our gradient descent. So basically, gradient descent, generally it was used for most of the purposes, but two problems that we face here in this gradient descent. First, if the size of our data set is too huge, then it becomes difficult to work on using the gradient descent. Second is, it works well for the convex function, but it does not know how far to travel for the non-convex functions.